Most people in the world do not understand how evil this party is. It amazes me. It constantly amazes me that people do not understand the nature of this system. It's entirely possible that the Chinese Communist Party, and again, we don't know this for certain, but it's entirely possible based on their strategy that the way China reacted to the virus was by saying, well, China's not going to be the only place that's going to be sick from this virus, and therefore they facilitated the spread. They let people travel, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Why is it so important to understand the true origins of Wuhan coronavirus, or CCP virus, and any connection to biolabs in Wuhan? Is the United States and the Chinese Communist Party engaged in a new Cold War? How is the Chinese regime a more sophisticated adversary than the Soviet Union? And how has the world fundamentally failed to understand the true nature of the Chinese Communist regime? In this episode, we sit down with Bill Gertz, a national security correspondent for the Washington Times and author of Deceiving the Sky, Inside Communist China's Drive for Global Supremacy. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Bill Gertz, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Bill, I always like to say this whenever we speak. You know, you've been very clear on the China and the Chinese Communist Party for at least 20 years. 20 years ago, you put out The China Threat, which still remains an important book. I think that I'd recommend to anyone. But the last week, or even a little bit longer, you've been writing a lot about the importance of understanding the origins of this coronavirus, or CCP virus, as we call it at the Epoch Times. Of course, as you know, we've also been very interested in this question. Tell me, what is it that you've found?
Well, I've interviewed a number of virus experts, including former Army medical doctors who've worked at Fort Detrick, which does the U.S. biological weapons research. And they've told me that it's extremely important to get the details, both scientific and regular, on the origin of the virus. The reason you need that is twofold. One, it's to find cures, therapies, and vaccines for the original virus. And second, it's to be able to understand and handle any kind of future pandemics. Again, this is the second time this CCP virus, as you say, is the second time China has caused a pandemic. Some say the third time, but at least the second time based on the SARS virus. Again, this is called SARS-2 in techno-speak. And again, it's very, very important. The Chinese have not cooperated. And at the same time, their propaganda organs are calling for U.S. and international cooperation. They're in full cover-up mode.
Well, so this is kind of this bizarre reality, and I think this speaks to some of the work actually you've done, and certainly we've done as well at the Epoch Times. On one hand, you have the Chinese Communist Party saying everyone needs to cooperate. Why aren't you cooperating? And on the other hand, we have this new headline, right, that I was just looking at today about suppression of research related to origins of the virus in China. I mean, it's like the opposite of cooperation. What's happening?
It's clear to me that, again, the Chinese are in full disinformation and cover-up mode. That is the Communist Party of China. And as part of that, they recognize that there have been a number of scientific studies produced by Chinese scientists that have been published in international journals. And this is giving information which is raising more questions about the origin of this virus. Right now, the official explanation by the Chinese party is that this came from a wet market, wild animal food market in Wuhan, which we all know was extremely close to the Wuhan Centers for Disease Control, which was conducting extensive bat coronavirus research. That research has not been discussed. I'm amazed that, for example, at these daily White House coronavirus task force briefings, not a single reporter has asked the experts or the president whether or not there is information indicating that this virus leaked from a lab, and have the Chinese Communist Party and government been pressed on providing details about that. We've got to get to the bottom of this. We're not going to solve this pandemic until we get the details on how it started, how this outbreak started.
Yeah, and actually, there's one thing I wanted to clarify, and I think there's this sort of misconception that has allowed a lot of people to yell conspiracy theory or something like that. Lab origin doesn't equal that it was engineered, and that doesn't equal that it was a bioweapon or something like that. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. I will start out by pointing out that on January 26th, I was one of the first reporters to write with the headline, "Coronavirus may have originated in Chinese lab." And I quoted an Israeli retired Israeli military intelligence expert, doctor, who had studied the Chinese biological weapons program. And this article said that the idea that it escaped from a lab, that it was under research, was very plausible. There was an immediate reaction from both the Chinese government denounced it. They sent a letter to the editor accusing us of spreading a quote, conspiracy theory. And several supposed fact-checking news outlets like USA Today and Snopes also criticized the article and called it false information. There was nothing false in that article. In fact, in that article, I talked about how the Chinese internet was rife with rumors from the Chinese authorities spreading the idea that this virus was actually started by the US CIA. And I predicted accurately what has actually played out now. Again, I was pointing out nobody knows the origin, but as the FBI would say, this is a clue. We have a laboratory that has conducted extensive bat coronavirus research. We have a market where the outbreak supposedly occurred. We have the Chinese going into that market and completely erasing all information about the animals at that market. And we have the Chinese Communist Party preventing the arrival in China of US and international experts for a period of about 2 weeks after the outbreak occurred. All of this suggests to me that there is a much bigger story about the origin of the virus and that it clearly is related to some type of research that was being conducted. And the reason that we're seeing, again, this conflated notion that it was being biologically engineered and escaped from a lab is clearly a straw man argument that doesn't look at it. Now, I wrote in my Washington Times column recently that this view is changing, that even the Nature Medicine and the top virus experts in the US have reevaluated that. And they're now saying that it's clear China has conducted extensive research in unsecure labs like the one at the Wuhan CDC, as well as there have been escapes of virus from Chinese labs. And therefore, these scientists have concluded we have to examine the possibility. Now, their main argument is that this was a natural jump, and I think that's a reflection of a certain political bias in the US scientific community. Some experts have compared it to what happened to the nuclear engineering field after the Fukushima reactor disaster in Japan. The engineers came under harsh criticism. And I think the biotechnical community in the US is trying to avoid that kind of a meltdown of their own credibility. They'd rather say that it was the result of some poor peasant mishandling some wild animal meat at a market rather than the escape from a scientific laboratory.
Right, and I mean the thing is, they were collecting numerous of these, even bad coronaviruses. There's even evidence that some of them actually could infect humans. It could have been just one of these in the collection that had gotten out that was being researched or whatnot. I mean, the thing is, we just don't know.
And there needs to be a major international pressure on China to say what it knows. Otherwise, again, we're not going to get to the bottom of this pandemic.
Bill, you mentioned that this is a cover-up. I think most people realize that there's a cover-up right now around the world. But could you lay out the range of how this cover-up exists? It's not just in one area, it's in multiple areas from what we're seeing. Can you lay that out for us?
Sure. I would say that this is a cover-up of information of strategic importance. And why do I say that? Because you have to understand Chinese strategy to understand really what's taking place now in terms of how the CCP in particular is responding to this crisis. The Chinese strategy has been outlined by Xi Jinping as the so-called China dream. It's actually the China nightmare, and that nightmare is that the Communist Party of China becomes the dominant force politically, economically, financially, in every way. And the key part of that strategy is for China to achieve this Xi Jinping nightmare around the world, they have to go after the United States. And clearly that's part of China's strategy. It's also something that has been outlined in the book by two colonels back in 1999 called Unrestricted Warfare. It's also part of Sun Tzu, who said the acme of skill is defeating your enemy without firing a shot. And so what we're seeing now is that China is really jumping on the opportunity, the strategic opportunity to further weaken the United States. And I think we're seeing that play out across a number of different areas, most notably in the propaganda and information warfare. I've argued for many years now that the Chinese party is engaged in information warfare. I've argued that we're in a new Cold War, that the CCP today is definitely a much more sophisticated version of the Soviet Union, which we saw vanquished in 1991. And they're doing everything possible to weaken the United States.
Well, so let's talk about this, information war. On one hand, there's certain information that's being suppressed. For example, the research on the virus origins, and even whether more of that research can even happen over there, I guess. On the other hand, there's certain messaging which is being pushed really hard. Can you lay that out?
Sure. The Chinese have done a number of studies, and I think one of the more significant ones was published in late January in The Lancet, and it was done by a group of 29 Chinese scientists who looked at the first 41 patients who contracted the disease caused by the Wuhan virus. And in this study, they revealed for the first time that the first patient to show symptoms showed up at the Wuhan Medical Center, that is the Wuhan hospital, on December 1st. Subsequent to that, there was a period of about 2 weeks where the cases began to mushroom. But the interesting thing is the very first person who showed up was an older man who had no connection to the Huanan seafood market, which the Chinese claim was the origin point of the outbreak. He was an older man. He lived several stops away. But first of all, this indicates that there was no single animal jump, that this outbreak didn't occur from an animal jumping to humans and then continuing, that this was human to human. Subsequent to that, the Chinese have gone into full cover-up mode and worse, disinformation mode. There have been a number of reports, unofficial, in Chinese press. For example, the PRC-controlled South China Morning Post reported unofficially that one of their reporters had seen a document stating that actually the first case of the Wuhan flu came up in November. And of course, this is part of a Chinese disinformation effort to obscure the Chinese origin of the virus. They have put out the first through their top virologist who said, well, the outbreak started here, the virus may have come from somewhere else. Then we saw the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman accuse the US Army, and that disinformation lie, that lie is based on a military sporting games that were held in Wuhan in October. So they're trying to prevent, as far as we know, and we don't have solid ground truth on the origins, but the most authoritative Chinese source, it was a government-funded study, was that late January Lancet report that said the first patient was December 1st.
Well, and there were also Yeah, of course, the sequence was done by a Chinese lab, and it was published into the public domain, thank goodness. And then that whole operation was kind of wrapped up, and clearly they weren't supposed to publish that sequence. I found that really disturbing.
Yes, I've looked closely at the early stages of the outbreak, and we saw a number of extremely troubling things, but very characteristic of a hardline communist regime. The first was, again, the suppression of the doctors who were trying to alert their coworkers. And of course, we saw how that ended, that one of the top doctors was stricken with the disease and became a major heroic figure in China, someone who stood up to the reviled Communist Party of China in trying to get the word out. So the Chinese have been very aggressive going after their scientists. And then, as you mentioned, a Shanghai lab that first produced the genome sequencing, he sent it to the National Health Commission and Chinese authorities on January 5th. No action was taken. So that scientist then went and published it by himself. And that was like 2 weeks later. And as a result of those efforts, his lab was shut down. So clearly, again, information control and cover up are the key features. And yet at the same time, we hear almost on a daily basis CCP propagandists coming out and saying, oh, we need international cooperation, don't politicize the virus. And of course, those are blatant lies, and worse, they're disinformation of a strategic nature, which is basically causing the death of mass deaths and economic dislocation around the world.
Something particularly I think I'll have to say, despicable is this sort of targeting of, I was going to say African Americans, but it's not Americans, basically folks from the African subcontinent who don't look Chinese, as if they're the ones that are carrying the virus, which is like the most bizarre, preposterous thing I can almost imagine.
Yeah, again, this is the party has been playing the race card heavily. And of course, the Communist Party of China is one of the most racist organizations in the entire world, discriminating against anyone who's not Han Chinese. And of course, we see what's going on in Xinjiang is, basically a crime against humanity. And again, organ harvesting against Falun Gong followers, sending nuclear and strategic weapons materials to Iran and North Korea. I think if there's any silver lining in this horrible pandemic crisis, it's that it's waking up to the world to the true nature of the Communist Party of China, something that, as you mentioned in the beginning, I've been trying to do for over 20 years. And I think that's really a positive step.
Yeah, and you're making, I had someone on, Maura Moynihan, talking about the realities in Tibet and this whole sort of forced assimilation, Han assimilation in Tibet, which has been, if you want to destroy a culture, incredibly effective, so to speak.
Yes, again, it's all part of the Communist Party's drive for global supremacy, as I outlined in my book, Deceiving the Sky. I mean, this is a existential threat to the fundamental values of freedom and democracy, free markets, free speech. It's under assault right now, and it's incumbent upon people everywhere to wake up to this danger and to push back against it. It's not simply enough to just look the other way, and I think a lot of the mainstream media in the United States and around the world have done that as well. There's this liberal left notion that somehow the Communist Party of China, its brand of Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics is the wave of the future, a progressive force, and that is just not the case. It poses an existential threat to all our way of life.
Something that's really remarkable, and this is you covered this recently, is that even very high level Chinese officials or billionaires, so forth, aren't immune. If they kind of criticize the party line, they themselves could be subject to censure, kind of like what we saw in the Strike Hard campaign some years back. I'm wondering if you could, there's one recent case that you outlined, and this guy is so highly connected. It's amazing that he's being investigated to me.
Yeah, this is the story of Ren Zhiqiang. He's a billionaire real estate tycoon and a member of the Communist Party of China. I've been following him since 2016. In fact, in my book, Deceiving the Sky, I was planning to have a section on him because it represents a significant rift among the senior leadership of the CCP, but it got cut from the story, from the book, just for space. But recently, Ren was detained by authorities. In March, he wrote a highly critical letter about Xi Jinping, the Chinese supreme leader, and this really marked the beginning of his demise. Back in 2016, he did a similar thing. Again, this is not a dissident by any means. This is a party member, and he back then said that unless there was a free and open press, that the party would become a tyrannical regime, and which is again playing out. Back in 2016, they silenced Ren by cutting off his WeChat account, his social media account, which had, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 33 million followers. So he was very popular. But the significant thing about the Ren case is that he is a representative, albeit indirectly, of a very powerful faction within the ruling Communist Party. He is very close to Wang Qishan, who is currently the vice president. Back in 2016, when Ren was battling Xi in public until he was silenced, a very interesting thing happened. The Communist Party Disciplinary Commission, which Wang headed, issued a statement in support of Ren. It was a very unusual move. But what it signaled to many people in China and elsewhere around the world, that this guy was somebody to watch, because he was not just a Donald Trump of China, as he was called at one point, but he represents a real significance. So his detention and the announcement that he had conducted illegal activities is an indication that he's got a one-way ticket to the Chinese gulag, and will be making sneakers over there for Nike pretty soon. And what it says is that Xi Jinping and Wang Qishan, the vice president and president, all is not well inside of Zhongnanhai, as the leadership compound is known.
Well, so, and this is, we've been hearing this, I think Kyle Bass was saying recently that some of his sources are saying there's this increased infighting and questions about Xi Jinping's leadership. What are you seeing? We're hearing similar things. What are you seeing?
I don't know. Again, the experts that I talk to and the officials that I talk to, they don't think that Xi Jinping's leadership is threatened. That said, the party in China and Xi as the leader of that party are under an enormous and growing pressure, not just within China, but from around the world. Xi Jinping is becoming increasingly unpopular. Things have been showing up on the social media indicating, coming from within the party, saying it's time for a change, it's time for Xi Jinping to step down. So the problem is the U.S. does not have good intelligence on what's going on inside China. And so it's very opaque. We don't have the sources inside Zhongnanhai that we need. And as I outlined in my book, back in 2010, we lost over 24 recruited agents. The Chinese basically wiped out the CIA's agent network inside China. It's been 10 years. My guess is they have not been able to successfully rebuild those networks. So we're really at a loss to get that kind of inside information about what's going on.
Let's talk a little bit about, just national security realities, and also, especially what the situation in the South China Sea right now. We're getting all sorts of interesting reports about how basically the Chinese Communist Party is acting very aggressively. These increased flights near Taiwan, the sinking of a Vietnamese fishing boat. I was reading this kind of laugh out loud Global Times tweet about why Vietnam is intruding into the South China Sea at this time, is trying to use COVID-19 to increase the tension of Vietnam-China relations. So there's the information warfare you've been talking about. But so what is China doing in the region there now?
Again, this goes back to unrestricted warfare and the ability to seize opportunities. The Chinese military sees that United States is grappling with the health crisis caused by the CCP virus. And so they're taking advantage of it by stepping up some of their operations in the South China Sea. We've seen them conduct some big naval exercises near Taiwan. The U.S. has responded by sending warships into that area. Just recently, a guided missile destroyer went through the Taiwan Strait. And one of the interesting results of the recent coronavirus crisis is that the United States is moving closer to Taiwan. Again, this is something that the Chinese didn't anticipate and do not like. So we're probably going to see some perhaps increased tensions, especially in the East China Sea and in the South China Sea. It's been a flashpoint. It's likely to become a more tension-filled flashpoint in the coming weeks and months.
It's very interesting. Now, this makes me think of, let's call it, in quotes, mask diplomacy, okay? Now, on one hand, we see the Chinese Communist Party has been saying, we're donating, it's got Huawei donating ventilators to New York State. It's got all these masks being sent out. It's selling a lot of material that it says it's being donated by all accounts now from what we're hearing. But the crazy thing about this is that a lot of this stuff, including testing kits for crying out loud, turns out to be defective. And I'm still haven't figured out, a few people have spoken to this, why they're doing this, because how is this going to work out positively for you? Of course, at the same time, Taiwan is doing something on a smaller scale to much great fanfare. So it's just a fascinating juxtaposition. And why would they be sending out this faulty gear?
Well, 2 points on that. First, right now, the entire world is angry at China, and rightly so. They mishandled the early stages of the outbreak. They allowed 5 million people to leave Wuhan and go all over the world, causing this pandemic to explode in a major way that's basically crippled the entire world economy and forced half the world's population to be under lockdown. So they're trying to change the image of China by the donations. On the faulty equipment, again, my understanding of unrestricted warfare and the way the Communist Party is such a nefarious force. And again, most people in the world do not understand how evil this party is. It amazes me. It constantly amazes me that people do not understand the nature of this system. It's entirely possible that the Chinese Communist Party, and again, we don't know this for certain, but it's entirely possible based on their strategy that the way China reacted to the virus was by saying, well, China's not going to be the only place that's going to be sick from this virus, and therefore they facilitated the spread. They let people travel, and that's what we're seeing right now. As for faulty equipment, think about it. If you were to send test kits that were, say, 1,000 test kits and say, oh, maybe 900 of them were normal test kits, but 100 of them were designed to be faulty tests, you could actually contribute to spreading the virus to a further extent. And again, that's a worst case scenario, but I would not put it past the Chinese Communist Party to do something like that. Again, if you look at their strategy, in order for China to gain global supremacy, they need the United States and the developed world to decline.
I've had similar thoughts to this, Bill. That this is exactly the kind of thing. This is what I would tell the viewers, right? Consider forced organ harvesting has been a reality in China for at least 15 years, if not longer. Murder for organs on a large scale sanctioned by the state. What wouldn't this organization do?
It's a reality. It's a potential reality. And because of the nature of the system over there, it cannot be ruled out. And it's not a conspiracy. And anybody that calls it a conspiracy is basically being deceptive or ill-informed.
Bill, another thing that we're seeing is basically Chinese diplomats, and this isn't just the Global Times and some of these other propaganda mouthpieces of the Communist Party, which typically agitate and take kind of confrontational stances, but now we're seeing Chinese diplomats, which typically don't take stances this provocative, basically going on the warpath, being aggressive in social media, challenging governments, sending letters. Seems like a new thing. Can you speak to this?
Sure. We're seeing a shift to a much more hardline ideological stance by Chinese ambassadors. And I've seen some things that have just surprised me to the point where it's considered definitely a violation of diplomatic protocol for an ambassador in his country to criticize the host government. And we've seen that in the United States. They should start throwing these ambassadors out of the country if they do that. Again, it's just a violation of the rules. The Chinese diplomatic corps and the foreign ministry in general have kind of operated in the past like mafia lawyers. In other words, their job was to basically deal with a criminal client. Again, because they felt that these ambassadors weren't being aggressive enough, they're basically telling them to step up the propaganda and disinformation themes, and it's all part of the information warfare to try to maintain China's spin on the international narrative of the coronavirus crisis.
Over the last, I guess you could say 5 years, we've seen, this kind of significant shift in how the U.S. perceives the Chinese Communist Party, the regime, how, obviously the national security strategy changed considerably, a little more recently. And it's almost like this whole coronavirus, CCP virus situation is just kind of a validation of this shift.
Well, again, going back to the seize the opportunity strategy of unrestricted warfare, we know that the Chinese do not want Donald Trump to be reelected. I mean, the White House has said that, the president has said that, the vice president, the secretary of state. Again, the media they're into the Russia hysteria mode, so they can't focus on that. But that's clearly what's happening now. We're seeing China take the opportunity to try to weaken and undermine Trump. The other thing, they did a big trade deal, which was definitely unfavorable to China. China is going to have to buy $250 billion worth of American products. President is trying to salvage that by kind of pulling his punches in public in talking about the CCP. And in fact, the trade deal, a lot of people think that it is going to be toast, and that the fact that they're going to try to get another phase of that deal is very difficult now that we've been plunged into a global recession. So I think the Chinese now are working behind the scenes and through their information operations to try to further weaken the president. They know that he's a tough customer, and they would much rather deal with a feckless Joe Biden as president than a Donald Trump who has pressed the Chinese harder than any U.S. administration in the past 35 years.
How are they working to undermine the president and the administration from what you've seen?
Well, we know that in the past, what they've done is they've put ads into farm state newspapers. They've put those Global Times supplements. The other operations, again, are a little bit more subtle and behind the scenes. Who knows exactly what kind of support they're giving to the Democratic Party. The U.S. government has not disclosed any more details in recent months, but I recall what the vice president has said, that based on the information he's seen from intelligence sources, it's clear that the Chinese want another president other than Donald Trump.
Bill, that's interesting that you say that, because there's a number of people, a recent column by Josh Rogan talking about how, a bipartisan consensus is kind of emerging around the Chinese Communist Party and so forth. And, you look at, someone like Speaker Nancy Pelosi has been, to my eye, incredibly clear on the Chinese Communist Party over the last odd 20 years. And I think Chuck Schumer to some extent as well, as the leadership on the Democratic side. What are you seeing?
It is true that there is an emerging bipartisan consensus on the China threat. However, I think that the Democratic Party has never gotten over the 2016 election. They're still in virulent anti-Trump mode. In other words, they recognize China as a major strategic threat, but their goal is to regain power through the Congress and through the executive branch. And so they're really pinning all of their efforts on discrediting Donald Trump as president. I think we saw that in the New York Times recently, which went after the president and tried to say that he didn't act fast enough. Again, it was a really, you could tell that there was a lack of serious criticism, but it was based on more the emotion of how much the Democratic Party and the liberal news media dislike Donald Trump. I think the president has done a very good job. I think he's done things like regional and local lockdowns that are against his nature, and I think that he wants very much to get the country back to work, and I think that we will do that very soon. Again, there's going to be big political debate about how soon to lift controls and how soon to get back to work, but clearly, I don't think the virus has been as deadly as it was initially predicted. Now, it is a devastating disease, and it has caused many, many deaths, and we have to recognize that. But we also have to recognize that we have a country that needs to get back on its feet, that it's been knocked down, and it's time to get back up.
So in this vein, this lack of information out of China and disinformation out of China, courtesy of the Chinese Communist Party, it probably affected the decision-making here on the ground. Do you have a sense of this?
It's hard to tell. Whenever the Secretary of State has been pressed on why we haven't been tougher on China and the CCP, his answer has been, now's not the time, but he's made it very clear that there will be a reckoning. So, and several other officials have also said that. I think the president has kind of hinted that way as well. It is, I think it's time that we do it now, that we don't wait, that we can do two things at once. One is to deal with the health crisis, and secondly, deal with the Communist Party of China, which caused it. And again, there's this kind of a knee-jerk reaction to go easy on the Chinese Communist Party. And that's been our policy for the last 35 years with devastating results. As I've pointed out in my book, we did a 35-year gamble. And the gamble was, let's be nice to the Chinese Communist Party and its government. Let's look the other way on their human rights abuses. Let's not press them or sanction them for selling weapons of mass destruction, missiles and nuclear goods to rogue states around the world. And the idea was that this would somehow create a moderated Communist Party. It's been an utter failure. And it's time now to tell the many China hands in the U.S. foreign policy community that they were wrong, and that it's time that they recognize they were wrong, that to stop worrying about whether they'll be denied a visa to travel to China, the way that China controls many of these academics, and that we really need a new policy. And let's start working on a new policy towards China.
Bill, there's this letter sponsored by the Asia Society, which is encouraging cooperation, even if there are ideological differences, even if people believe that China did something wrong, cooperation is still required to move forward. I mean, at least that's my very, very kind of rough reading of this letter. And some very interesting names on there that I wouldn't have expected necessarily. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, again, this is the part of the self-delusion on the American-China hands community. This notion that whatever China does, it's always incumbent upon the U.S. to seek cooperation. We've tried cooperating with them. They failed to cooperate in a strategic way in dealing with this deadly pandemic. And they need to be held accountable for that. And it's not too early to hold them accountable. And yet we see the same voices of these people who were totally wrong on U.S. policy towards China for decades, trying to defend their position that they weren't wrong. And I think, again, like I said, we just need to say, look, you people were wrong. You helped contribute to creating this strategic threat of communist China today, and you need to recognize that you were wrong.
Okay, Bill, we're going to finish up in just a moment. Any final thoughts before we do?
In terms of U.S. policy towards China, I think clearly a couple of things I would like to state, and this is going to be in a forthcoming monograph of mine. First of all, we need to do an in-depth American-led investigation into the origin of the Wuhan virus. We need to do that without UN interference, and it has to be done in a major, major way. We can't rely on the Chinese. We know that they've lied to us multiple times. Second, it's time to deal with the international organizations. We need to take aggressive action to basically oust China from international organizations. Peter Navarro, the White House advisor, said recently that of 15 major UN organizations, 5 have been basically co-opted or taken over by communist China. We need to expel China from these organizations. And if we're unable to expel China from these organizations, whether it's the UN or other, then we should leave those organizations ourselves and create new international organizations, basically that are untainted and by Chinese and dictatorships like that. And we move to a global democratic and free market alliance of people. Those are the 2 top recommendations that I would say that we need to take. I think it's urgent that we do that.
One quick question, given the reluctance of the Chinese Communist Party to allow any independent folks into Wuhan originally, destroying certainly the evidence in the market, plowing it, and this continued evidence that they're really not interested in helping people do the research. How can this deep dive be done that you're suggesting into understanding the origins?
Well, I think the international community should put together a team of experts that can do that. And again, I think that all friendly trade relations with China should be put on hold until that investigation is done. That's how you do it. You say, if you want to trade with the world, then you come clean on this investigation. Otherwise, forget it. We're not going to be trading with you. We're not going to have interaction with you.
Okay. Bill Gertz, such a pleasure to have you on again.
Thanks very much.